Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries headquarters. In it, we are treated to several people giving their best arguments for God's existence. So maybe this one will do it. Maybe this one will be where we finally figure out that God is real. Let's go!
Sometimes we're asked the question, can we prove the existence of God? And, you know, it's a strange idea because in one sense, there's a moral intuition that something exists, like Immanuel Kant talked about two great realities that basically inspired him.
Well, that was a lot of words to say not much of anything. First, he calls someone asking for proof of God's existence a strange idea. Why is it a strange idea? You want me to change my life based on the existence of God? I say maybe you should demonstrate that your God exists before I go ahead and make any of those changes, and you respond by saying, what a strange idea. Why is it strange that I would want evidence for the existence of the thing that you want me to believe exists? And then there's this appeal to Kant's two great realities, which, as far as I can tell, is a reference to transcendental idealism, but just thrown out there as though everyone is supposed to already just be intimately familiar with the works of Kant with no explanation. Now, I am not particularly interested in in-depth philosophical discussions. While I do understand the importance of philosophy, I feel like a good chunk of the philosophical discourse is completely obscure to most people, and for discussions such as this, it would be helpful if you give a brief simplified overview of what you're talking about, rather than just saying, you know, like Kant's two great realities, as though everyone in the audience should already be familiar with it. When making a video aimed at a general audience, speaking like that makes it seem as though you are basically appealing to philosophical ideas that you know the audience won't be familiar with in an attempt to either obfuscate or to dress up an argument with the appearance of sophistication. To summarize and oversimplify Kant's idea of transcendental idealism, an object as we perceive it is not as it is in itself, as we are only capable of perceiving things that we are capable of intuiting, and this can be applied to introspection as well. Our perception of ourselves is based on how we intuit ourselves, not on how we actually are in ourselves. Now, it's not hard to see how religious philosophers would take this idea and run with it, saying that the thing in itself that we are not able to intuit exists as part of a spiritual reality, but that's not necessarily what Kant was getting at. As to there being moral intuition that something exists, if we're relying on moral intuitions, then based on the observation that immorality runs rampant in the world, I would be more inclined to believe that an apathetic God exists than one who actually cares and is morally good. I would also argue that the Christian God, as he is understood today, is not morally good. So, you know, maybe the Christian God does exist, but is apathetic. But then that raises the question as to what the whole point of sending Jesus even was, if he's apathetic. Given the fact that, according to the Christian scriptures, more people will go to hell than to heaven, then the whole Jesus saves thing actually seems to be more like the actions of a malevolent God rather than a loving or apathetic one. You'd think a loving God would have been able to come up with a better system that would save more people.
The starry heavens above, the moral law within. So there was a basic awareness. And I remember that even as a child, I didn't overtly believe in a God that I followed, but I believed that there was a God out there. It was almost like there was some sense.
Yes, if you grow up in a society in which most people believe in a God of some kind, you will probably intuitively feel that there is a God of some kind, just through cultural osmosis. There is some debate about how religion first developed, whether it was an adaptation to promote cooperation or whether it was a byproduct of already existing cognitive functions, but as more research goes into the origin of religion, one thing is becoming more clear. The idea of a singular God that is a moral authority comes after complex political society develops. And while a rather underrepresented group in antiquity, it is possible that atheism was actually rather common in ancient Greek and Roman cultures, which calls into question the idea that humans all come pre-built with a belief in the supernatural. So your personal experience might be that you intuitively think there's a God, but that is by no means a universal experience, which calls into question the idea that a God exists who wants a personal relationship with all of us.
So can we prove that God exists? I think there are evidential trails, but not proof in the sense of a mathematical proof like 2 + 2 = 4.
And here we arrive at the ultimate problem that everyone who posits the existence of a personal God eventually runs into. If a human being exists who wants to have a relationship with you, the first thing that they do is introduce themselves to you. They may be shy and might choose to have a third party do the initial introduction for them, but eventually, if they want the relationship, they have to show up themselves. So unless your picture of God is that of a shy teenager with a crush passing notes through mutual friends because he can't muster up the courage to talk to you himself, then we shouldn't need to follow these evidentiary trails and come up with arguments for his existence. He should just show up and say hi.
I think what we use is a sense of arguments that look for what we call the argument towards the best fit.
And the best fit is that God does not want a personal relationship with us, or he would initiate that relationship himself rather than expecting us to initiate it based on philosophical argumentation that is a lot of fluff without much substance.
Cumulative case arguments. So we look at various things, like in a murder case or a case trying to prove the issue of the guilt of someone in a crime. You have to gather evidence from many different pieces, and the cumulative case argument adds up. In that sense, I think we can point towards the existence of God, the probabilities.
Not really. Pretty much all of the arguments for God are either based on flawed premises, or they rely on our current lack of understanding about certain aspects of science, like abiogenesis or the Big Bang. The arguments for God that have the best chance of actually being sound arguments don't even get you to a God. The Kalam cosmological argument comes immediately to mind for that. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. At this time, we don't actually know if the universe did indeed begin to exist in the sense that is meant by this argument, but if I grant that it did, then that means the universe has a cause. It doesn't say anything about what that cause would be, and the William Lane Craig-style descriptions of what that cause has to be ends up being based entirely on assertions about things that we can't possibly know at this time.
But it's not the same as a mathematical proof.
Well, you shouldn't need a mathematical proof just to introduce me to your buddy.
If by prove we mean equating it with 100% certainty, then no, we cannot prove with 100% certainty the existence of God.
No, and this is why I don't really like the word proof and tend to gravitate more toward demonstrate rather than prove. I do not mean 100% certainty, although realistically, if anyone is capable of providing us with 100% certainty of their existence, it would be an all-powerful God. So if you can't give us 100% certainty of God's existence, then that's actually a failing on God's part. So really, if a God did exist, then you would be able to prove it with 100% certainty. But I'm not even asking for that. Just provide me with something.
But is the existence of God the most probable explanation for all that is? I think we have reasons, we have arguments that have come down through history.
Yeah, we already know that people who believe in God are convinced that God's existence is probable. That's probably the most unsurprising thing you could possibly say about someone's God belief. I find those arguments lacking and would like some sort of demonstration. I recently watched a debate between Matt Dillahunty and Braxton Hunter, and two things really struck me about it. Braxton kept bringing up hypotheticals that he thought should warrant a belief in God, with Matt saying they probably wouldn't be enough to convince him. Things like a comet hitting the moon, causing it to break up and result in a debris field that is visible to everyone, which spells out God exists in scripts which everyone sees in their own language, or someone parting a sea in the name of Jesus. Things like that. The first thing that struck me about this is the fact that, as many of these hypotheticals as you can bring up, stuff like that just never happens. It's a thought experiment at best. There are many people who would be convinced by such actions, but such actions are never actually taken, just discussed academically to point out that some people wouldn't be convinced. So some people require an unreasonably high burden of proof. Well, whether or not you agree that these things would warrant a belief in God, the fact of the matter is that these things just don't happen. I'll let you know whether or not it convinces me when it actually happens. But the second thing that struck me was that later in the debate, during the audience question time, someone asked Braxton if someone split the sea in the name of Buddha, would that cause him to not believe in Jesus? And his answer essentially was that no, if that happened, it would probably be demons.
So my question is, what kind of evidence would it take for you to not believe if an asteroid hit the moon and it said there is no God in multiple languages, or if somebody split the sea in the name of Buddha? Would that change your mind?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Actually, My worldview, this is going to hang with me here. The Christian worldview actually accounts for supernatural stuff happening in other religions. I make no bones about it. I'm not the least bit ashamed to say that I believe there are supernatural forces that are positive and there are supernatural forces that are evil. And so for that reason, yeah, as a deception, I think there could be things in other religions.
I'm confused at this point. Why is it that such an action should be accepted as sufficient evidence that Jesus exists and is a god, but the exact same action performed in another god's name, the questioner specified Buddha, but as Buddha isn't a god in most Buddhist sects, let's correct it to another god. So if someone were to do this thing in another god's name, like Vishnu, that is not sufficient reason to believe in that other god. It's just such a blatant double standard.
That make the reasonableness of God and God's existence very, very probable and likely.
Whether or not it is probably reasonable to believe something does not impact whether or not that belief is a true belief. It can be perfectly reasonable to believe untrue things. If I zip up my fly after using the washroom, it is perfectly reasonable for me to believe that my fly is zipped up. But I have at least one pair of pants where the zipper does not stay zipped up, and it took me a while to figure out that the problem was the zipper, not my faulty memory. So there were times when it was perfectly reasonable for me to believe that my fly was zipped up, but that was a false belief since the zipper had slid down since being zipped up. To make matters worse, these were pants that I used for work, and part of my work uniform was an apron, so that provided plenty of time for the fly to slide all the way down without anyone warning me about it, making it much more obvious to other people that it was actually down after taking my apron off at the end of the shift. All this to say that even if you can demonstrate that it is reasonable to believe in God, that has no bearing on whether or not the belief in God is actually a true belief. That said, I also think that it has not been demonstrated that such a belief is indeed a reasonable belief, but that is a matter for debate.
What do we mean when we say prove?
And that's really the issue, isn't it? Because proof generally refers to a level of certainty that just isn't possible for most of the things outside math. And that is why I generally don't use the word proof, instead preferring terms like demonstrate or provide evidence for.
Everyone should have a certain level of certainty that they're looking for, and 100% certainty is just out of the question.
And this is where I flip-flop on my last position, because is it out of the question? Is the all-powerful creator of the universe just not able to provide anyone with 100% certainty? Presuppositionalist apologists along the Cy Ten Bruggencate and Eric Hovind lines can be incredibly frustrating to deal with due to their incredibly circular reasoning, but their ridiculous claims are at least in line with what one would expect to be the case should a god who wants people to believe in him actually exist.
We can't be 100% certain that we even exist. We can't have 100% certainty that we're even here when we're talking from a philosophical standpoint.
Right, the problem of hard solipsism. So, are you saying that our bar is too high for God to be able to pass it? Because I feel like an all-powerful God shouldn't have a problem with our bar no matter where it is set. But also, as I mentioned, this is why I don't ask for proof. I'm not looking for you to make me 100% certain. I'm just looking for evidence, and philosophical arguments just don't do it for me.
So the question is, how much certainty are you willing to have before you act or believe something?
That depends on the thing. If it's a mundane claim, like if you tell me you just set up a new fish tank, I won't require much in the way of proof or certainty in order to accept that claim because that's a normal thing that a lot of people do. And unless you're a pathological liar, there's no real reason to lie about your having done it. But if you told me you were the first person to book a room at Voyager Station, the low Earth orbit hotel that is planned to be built by 2027, I would want a bit more evidence to support that claim than I would for your fish tank claim. Even if you showed me your ticket and receipt, I might still doubt that you were actually the first person to book it. Also worth mentioning is that the level of evidence required will vary by person. Some people will be more inclined to take your word for it, especially if they're someone who knows you and knows that you have the resources and inclination to do such a thing. Or, on the flip side of that, maybe the people that know you will require greater evidence as they don't think you have the resources for it, and you have never showed an interest in space travel before. My point is, the level of evidence required to convince someone will change from person to person. So if you want to convince me, don't worry about how much evidence I'm going to need. Just provide me with your best evidence, and that will either do the trick or it won't. But you can rest assured that if your God exists, he knows exactly what level of evidence will do the trick for me, and he is capable of providing me with that level of evidence. So if he actually wants me to believe in him, he should not have a problem convincing me.
And that's what we need to come up with, thresholds of certainty. What is the most coherent explanation? What's the best explanation for the world around us?
Physics. The universe operates in the way that we can describe with various laws of physics. And that's as far as we can go without violating Occam's razor. Now, of course, Occam's razor is a principle rather than a scientific law. It isn't always the case. But it is an excellent principle to follow, and in the case of the universe, we don't appear to need God as an explanation at this time. So adding God as an explanation is an added assumption that violates Occam's razor. Does that mean there is no God? No, but it does mean that God is not necessary to explain the universe.
And if we look at it from that perspective, as we do everything in life, then we can have very good reason to believe that God exists.
So what are these very good reasons? Why do you explain why we can't be 100% certain without actually providing any of the reasons that you claim are very good? We have many models of the universe that explain how it could have gotten started without any supernatural intervention. Why do you think supernatural intervention is necessary?
Most of the time when people ask that kind of a question, they're looking for the type of proof that we really only find in mathematics and maybe some of the hard sciences.
And I can see that the answers to that question are dodges rather than any sort of actual presentation of evidence or anything. Yeah, I get it, you don't think it's possible to give proof of God that would give us the same certainty in his existence as we can have for mathematical principles, but rather than explaining that over and over again, why not actually provide evidence? I've said it before, and I'll likely say it again, but the best way to prove the existence of a person is to just introduce that person. I have never rejected the existence of a person that I've actually met. Why is God incapable of this bare minimum?
But that type of proof is really not necessary, it's not even helpful when we are trying to determine whether or not God exists and what our relationship with him should be.
Well, the bare minimum requirement for me to have a relationship with someone is for me to be convinced that the person I have the relationship with actually exists. So why are we even arguing about how much proof you should be providing? If you want me to be friends with your friend, at minimum you just have to convince me that your friend exists. So rather than pontificating over how we can't possibly have anything approaching mathematical certainty of God's existence, just make with the introductions.
What is more interesting is whether or not we can come to know that God exists.
That depends what you mean by know, and that depends on who you ask. It is a very subjective measurement. And keep in mind that it is possible to know something that is wrong. In my earlier example of having done up my zipper, after zipping up, I know that it is zipped up, even when it wasn't. So the existence of people who know that God is real is not ultimately convincing to me, because I know that it is possible to know things that aren't actually true.
And whether we can really have a relationship with him. And that is not a difficult question to answer, because the answer is yes. God has revealed himself to us in the person of Jesus Christ.
If he has revealed himself to us, then there shouldn't even be a question of whether or not you can prove God's existence. It should already be a settled matter for everyone. The fact that it is not reveals that God, as you have described him, does not exist. Sure, you can claim that people like me are just suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, but ultimately that's not very helpful. People that don't believe in God are not convinced that they are in fact suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, so to suggest that they are only serves to demonstrate to them that you are completely wrong on the matter.
Well, I believe we attempt to prove God's existence or argue for God's existence because the evidence is so strong.
The evidence is so strong that a guy who wants a relationship with me exists, and yet nobody has ever been able to introduce me to him. Sorry, but that doesn't exactly scream strong evidence to me. Instead of evidence, we get sophistry, philosophy, and excuses.
It's so compelling that it seems almost illogical to argue against God's existence.
Given that every philosophical argument for God's existence that I have ever seen is either fundamentally flawed or doesn't get you all the way to a God, I'm going to go ahead and just reverse that a bit. If you need to make use of faulty logic to argue for God, is it the people pointing out the faulty logic that are being illogical, or the people who insist that their opponents really secretly agree with them but can't admit it because they want to sin? Bearing in mind that this is coming from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. You remember Ravi Zacharias, right? That Christian speaker who is, at this point, well known for his sex scandals? Sure, this video was made before any serious allegations were made public, but it never ceases to amaze me that apologists will accuse atheists of suppressing the truth of God's existence as an excuse to sin. Meanwhile, scandal after scandal keeps popping up in the various churches, so it seems that a suppression of God is not a necessary prerequisite for sinful behavior. Weird that I would choose to go to hell so that I can continue not cheating on my wife, while people like Ravi Zacharias get to go enjoy eternal paradise after sexually abusing several women over a period of several years. You'd think that if I really knew that God existed, I would take the Ravi route and profess my belief in him while continuing to sin and asking forgiveness for those sins to get a free pass into paradise. Denying God doesn't make any sense given how the whole salvation thing works.
So again, if somebody sets out to prove God's existence with 100% certainty, they're likely to be disappointed.
Which doesn't make any sense if God actually exists and is capable of providing this 100% certainty. Why do you not trust that God is powerful enough to meet what should be for him a very low bar? I mean, maybe God exists and it is possible for him to give us 100% certainty of his existence, but he doesn't want us to have 100% certainty. That would be one option, but then the statement that he wants a relationship with us doesn't make sense because generally relationships involve an acceptance of the other person's existence.
But if they set out to show the reasonableness for the existence of God, then I think there are very strong arguments that can be made, and we can have some degree of satisfaction with that.
Just as I could have argued reasonably that my fly was zipped up, as I had excellent reason for believing that it was. That does not mean that it actually was zipped up, though.
There is grounding, there is a foundation for belief in God.
Just as I had excellent grounding and a foundation for belief in the zipped-uppedness of my fly. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Krankar Voland, who says, "So if no one will die for a lie, that means fundamentalist Muslims are right. Making a suicide attack for Allah risks your life much more than preaching Jesus in the relatively tolerant Roman Empire. Most religions have their martyrs. Claiming that people died for a lie is dumb because no martyr thinks they're wrong." Well, to steelman the actual position, the apologists will point out that the disciples didn't just die for a lie. They died for a lie and were in a position to know for sure whether or not what they were dying for actually was a lie or whether it was true, whereas the martyrs for the other religions are not in that position. Which is why I brought up the Roman guard. If we are to believe the story in Matthew, and we are to believe that the guard was indeed a Roman guard and not the temple guard, then them spreading the story that the disciples stole Jesus' body while they were asleep at their posts would most definitely have led to them being executed for dereliction of duty, which means that, according to the Bible, these Roman soldiers were willing to die for a lie that they knew for sure was a lie. So either people are, at least occasionally, willing to die to preserve a lie that they know is a lie, and so the argument that the disciples wouldn't have died for a lie loses its footing, or they couldn't have been lying because nobody would die for a lie, so it must be that the disciples stole the body while they were asleep at their posts. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the apron that allowed me to believe that the fly that is my channel was zipped up. If you'd like to hide my shame, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!